Well, Boker Tov, good morning. Shalom Aleichem, everybody. Welcome to our Aliyah this morning. Glad to be with you. We are in Parasha Achrei Mot, which means after the death. You know, incidentally, just popped in my brain. So we had Achrei Shel Pesach, which means at the last day of Pesach, and we have Achrei Mot. So maybe you can hear a similarity in those words, Acharon, and Achrei, obviously are similar words, same root word, I should say. So as you're, listening to Hebrew, starting to learn Hebrew, you start to pick up on those kinds of things. Just something interesting I thought I would mention. All right, so we're talking about here in the first part of Achrei Mot, we're talking about the ceremony, the procedure for Yom Kippur. I pretty much left off yesterday talking about an insight from the Humash that discusses the death of the righteous and how it brings atonement. And I mentioned that that's a fundamental concept that one needs to remember, that the death of the righteous does in fact bring atonement. And I mentioned also, let's not forget that all of the concepts, and this is, I know for some this is raises eyebrows, but it's true. All of the concepts that we are aware of, that we believe in about the Messiah, all of them come from the rabbinic literature, the Oral Torah. And to be a bit more specific historically, all of those concepts, every single one of them, come from the Pharisees. The Sadducees did not believe in the Messiah. The Zealots in the first century were militant. Basically, the Zealots were essentially terrorists. They were Jewish pro-Zionist terrorists who didn't necessarily believe in the Messiah. The Essenes believed in the Messiah, but they were a cult group that did not leave their compound. Some people, by the way, surmise that Yeshua was an Essene. I'm not exactly sure why they believe that, but that was, I don't know, I'm not sure if it still is, but that was a very popular concept amongst non-Jewish, so-called Torah followers for a long time. I think maybe the reason why that was such a popular concept, and maybe it still is, I don't know, was because people are generally comfortable with the Messiah being a zealot or being an Essene or being nothing, but they really cringe when they discover, or when they're told that Messiah was in fact a Pharisee, which, by the way, is supported by that concept is not by any means out in left field. It's supported by virtually every actual scholar, vetted, published scholar. And because the reason for that, by the way, is because it's so obvious. It may not be obvious to you because, people aren't necessarily equipped, if you will. I don't want to sound like you have to be a genius, but what I mean is that you don't know what you don't know. So people aren't really sure what to look for. But the bigger problem is that most people are taught, again, it's that mental conditioning, that Chinese water torture. They're taught that the Pharisees are the bad guys. And then Yeshua didn't come to do away with the Torah. He came to do away with the Pharisaical traditions. Yeah. That was the problem. Actually, it wasn't the problem. In fact, when Yeshua is talking to the Pharisees about the fact that he's allowing sinners to come and eat with him, he actually tells them that the well do not need those who are healthy, those who are not sick, do not need a physician, i.e., you Pharisees are fine. Therefore, the physician goes to those who need help, i.e. the sinner. So Yeshua actually makes a very bold statement declaring that the Pharisees aren't sick. That's completely contrary to what people think. Now, going back to what I was saying, the reason that concept raises eyebrows is because people, when they read the Torah, they've been trained through various, theological systems to read into the not just the Torah, but also the prophets, to read into the prophets these messianic concepts. However, the reality is those messianic concepts are derived directly from the Oral Torah itself, and I want you to understand this. In fact, I mentioned yesterday on the road to Emmaus. In fact, let me just turn there right quick, just really quickly. Hopefully this is a productive conversation to have, so that everybody will understand. If we go to, where is this road to Emmaus? Is it? Just try to find it right quickly. He says something very interesting in this discussion. Where is that particular verse I'm looking for? It'll only take me a second to find it. But again, hopefully this conversation is important to have, because I think it will, unlock, some bias that prevents people from really getting involved in what they're in the actual walk of Torah, because people have been led to believe erroneously that that somehow, some way, the Jews are still the enemy, and Yeshua did not come to make war against Jews or Judaism. So yeah. Okay, road to Emmaus, Luke chapter 24. Where is it? He said, So if you, so here in around about verse 19, start reading in 19, it says, Yeshua is asking these guys, what's going on? And they say about Yeshua of Nazareth, they replied, he was a prophet, powerful in word and deed before God and all the people. The chief priests and our rulers handed him over to be sentenced to death, and they crucified him. Now, that's an important statement because it implicates who the perpetrators were of this. And it was the chief priest, Caiaphas, and the rulers. Okay, who are the rulers? These are the government, the Roman appointed people. So, and that includes, in fact, Caiaphas. Some people don't realize this, but the high priest had to be of the lineage of Aaron in order to qualify for that office. And he was high priest for life until he got too old to perform his duties, in which case he would retire or he would die. But you didn't change high priest willy-nilly. But what happened with the Roman governors, we learned this from reading the writings of Josephus, that every time there was a newly appointed Roman governor, he would select, the Roman governor, would select his own high priest, because if you control the high priest, you ostensibly control the people. And so he would select his own high priest, and the people who wanted the governor to select them as high priest would basically bribe the governor. So whoever the highest bidder was would receive that office and serve at the pleasure of the Roman governor. And Josephus brings down that there were multiple Roman governors that oversaw the Jews in what was called Judea. And sometimes the governors would throne and dethrone high priests through their tenure because they weren't pleased with how they were serving them. When it came to Pontius Pilate, he chose Caiaphas, who bribed him for that office. So Caiaphas was his puppet. And this is, of course, subsequent other rulers and leaders were also appointed by Rome. And so the reason why, these guys turned the Messiah over is because the concept of the Messiah, of course, is that he's going to come and he's going to bring the tribes together, and he's going to teach Torah, and he's going to overthrow Edom. Well, who's Edom? Edom is Rome. And so, by the way, everything I just said, stuff that you and I believe and have believed pretty much most of our religious life, all of it comes from Pharisaical rabbinic writing and the Oral Torah. None of it comes from, not one jot or tittle of it comes from the written Torah or the prophets. And so, naturally, Caiaphas doesn't want Rome to be overturned, because that for him equals total loss of power, total loss of prestige. So we can see here it's a political issue here. It's not a religious issue. It wasn't the Pharisees who betrayed Yeshua. It wasn't oral Torah that was the big problem. All of that is just coming from an anti-Semitic spirit that is inherent in Christianity. I'm sorry, people who believe that way. And here's the reality. If you're somebody, and listen to me, because you could be watching right now and you're this person I'm talking to. You're not Jewish, you're a Gentile, you belong to a Hebrew roots movement or whatever, or maybe even a Messianic movement, and you think that Yeshua didn't come to destroy the Torah, he came to fight against the oral law. But guys, everything you believe about the Messiah, every single bit of it comes from the oral law. All of it. In fact, the very concept of Messiah comes from the oral law, is not derived from the written law, nor is it derived from the prophets, nor from the writings. It all comes from the oral law. This is a fact. It's an actual fact, I'm telling you. And so if you believe that the Messiah came to somehow fight against the Jews or fight against the Jewish religion or overturn oral Torah, you're still a Christian. You still have within you that poison. And I hate to put it this way, but it's true. And sometimes you have to speak frankly and honestly about things in order to kind of get it out on the table. And so that's the problem. It's that poison of anti-Semitism that still infects you. And so they're saying, look, our leaders and our rulers turned him over. And so it says here, but we had hoped that he was the one who was going to redeem Israel. And what is more, it is the third day since all this took place. In addition, some of our women amazed us. They went to the tomb early in the morning, but did not find his body. They came and told us that they had seen a vision of angels, and he was still alive. Then some of our companions went to the tomb and found it just as women had said, but they did not see him. Now, Yeshua said to them, how foolish are you, and how slow of heart to believe all the prophets have spoken. Did not the Messiah have to suffer these things and then enter into his glory? And beginning with Moses and all the prophets, he examined to them what was said in the scriptures concerning himself. Now, what is interesting to me about that passage is, yes, he used he went in order to proclaim the gospel. He used Moses and the prophets. How many people, just asking, it's a rhetorical question, how many believers today that you know or know of, when it comes time to share the gospel of the Messiah, open up to Moses and the prophets? Right? How many have you known in your lifetime? I think the answer is somewhere near zero. Everybody opens up to Paul, right? Usually Paul is, it's like Paul and the Gospels. Yeshua used Moses and the prophets. And so that's just kind of an aside. We ought to, if we're going to share the gospel with people, then we should probably share the gospel that Yeshua shared and about himself. And if we're going to do that, then we should probably start with Moses and the prophets, as opposed to Paul, God forbid, and then the Gospels. But that's what most people do. But that's kind of an aside. Now, what I'm going to tell you is going to maybe shock you, or at least some of you. And that is that in order for Yeshua to share with these two men about the Messiah from the Gospels and the prophets, he would have had to have employed the traditional Jewish oral Torah understanding of those writings. The oral Torah, you understand, is essentially a commentary on the written Torah. Okay, that at its core, that's what it is. It's not like a brand new set of, oh, hey, look, we've got all these written laws. Let's just create subset law, category 2. That's not what it is. It's commentary on the written law and how to fulfill the written law. So therefore, the oral Torah is essentially a discussion of the fulfillment of the written Torah, and of course, there's commentary on the prophets as well. And so that's what Yeshua is bringing down, because nothing about him is actually found in the written Torah per se. In other words, not on the Peshat level. You have to go into the Darash and the Sod level. Okay, hopefully that makes sense. Now, somebody's asked a question, and they have said before, like, how do I get a copy of the oral Torah? And that's an interesting question. It's a good question, and the answer is that there isn't a copy of the oral Torah. The oral Torah is comprised essentially of the Mishnah, and so later there was a commentary on the Mishnah called the Gemara, and the Mishnah and the Gemara together make up what's called the Talmud. It's kind of like saying that the House of Representatives and the Senate make up the Congress. The Talmud, if you get the English Hebrew version, is about, I don't know, like 73 volumes or something like that. And so you're talking about the Encyclopedia Britannica size. So there's not a copy of it per se. And then, of course, then on top of that, you have the Agadot, which is the Midrash Rabbah, which is essentially, I like to kind of summarize it and say the Midrash Rabbah is sermon notes of the rabbis. And the Midrash Rabbah, the English Hebrew version, is roughly about, I think it's 16 volumes for the Midrash Rabbah. And then, of course, you could throw in the mix there, kind of unofficially, is the Zohar, which is really the Sod level, the mystical level of the scripture, looking at it from the mystical level. But pretty much that's what constitutes the oral, or excuse me, the oral Torah, the rabbinic writings. So just so you know, if you want to run out and grab a copy of the oral Torah so that you can, read through it right quick, and that's what we're talking about. In fact, I've had many conversations, too many, more than one is too many, but where I've had non-Jewish, people who are trying to follow a Torah walk per se, and they'll say to me something like, "Oh yeah, I've read the oral Torah." Ladies and gentlemen, it literally, if you're going to read a daf a day, which is a folio page, if you're going to read a daf a day, it's going to take you literally 7 years. Yes, I said 7. 7 years to read through the entire Talmud. 7 years. That's if you diligently read a daf a day. Now, a daf is equivalent. It varies, but basically you're talking about, I would say, 2 to 4 big pages a day. Okay. And there's programs about a daf a day program encouraging Jewish people to read a daf a day, et cetera, et cetera. And not many people do it because naturally, we all have lives to live and we're not always able to sit down and read a daf a day. But if you were to do that, it would take you literally 7 years to read the Talmud. That doesn't include the Midrash Rabbah, and it doesn't include the Zohar. So when somebody tells you, and they're not Jewish, I'm just saying, I'm trying to help people. My point here partially is to help people not get involved in these kind of cultist groups but like Hebrew roots groups. When someone tells you they're not Jewish, and like, yeah, I've read the Oral Torah, and they've been out of church for, I don't know, a minute, and they haven't. Okay, I haven't read through the entire Talmud. I have not, and just like I haven't read through the entire Encyclopedia Britannica either. It's a lifelong pursuit. Okay, so just so you know, and so you how do you eat an elephant? A little bit at a time. Elephants aren't kosher though, so don't do that. But okay, why is everything I just said yesterday and today about this? Why am I hammering this so? And that is because if you want to understand these concepts, you have to embrace rabbinic literature. If you do not embrace rabbinic literature as valid and legitimate, which it is, and frankly, I'm just going to go a step further. If you don't embrace Yeshua as a Pharisee, which he was, then you are going to get way, way off track in your theology. Now, I would like to think that a lot of people would believe that, trust that, love that. But I know that for a great many people, that's going to be a total deal breaker because they've been mentally conditioned to believe that Pharisees are the enemy and that the Oral Torah, that he must have come and he was fighting against the Oral Torah or something like that. And I don't know. Hopefully I'm wrong about that. Hopefully people can overcome that spirit. And by the way, this is probably a good time to mention again, if you've never watched the series we have, and I will try to remember to post this on the community link of this channel. The series that I did on the history and effects of anti-Semitism, the purpose of which was to help people identify the anti-Semitic spirit that they have. Because if you come out of Christianity, and I too fell into this category, which is why I was inspired to do the series. If you were baptized into Christian faith, I don't care what denomination, Catholic, Baptist, Pentecostal, Methodist, whatever, you were baptized into an anti-Semitic spirit. Because all of the church fathers of Rome, which is where every Christian denomination was rooted in, they were all super anti-Semitic. Like when I say anti-Semitic, I mean like Adolf Hitler type anti-Semitic. And so if you have to watch the series to understand what I'm talking about, but basically this is the truth. And so it was true for me too, as crazy as that sounds. And so basically the point of the series is to go, it's an 8-week series, is to go through it and to be able to recognize that and then to deal with that spirit spiritually and get rid of it and therefore be free to actually live a Torah observant life in Messiah as you're supposed to. Okay? Whew. Yeah, support crusades, anti-Semitic, yeah. Which, by the way, brings up something somewhat funny, but also instructive. So, people who believe in the Messiah, sometimes they don't know what they don't know. So the Crusades lasted, I don't know. The Crusades started, I think, I think they began in the late 12th century and lasted for 100 or 200 years, something like that. The Crusades were allegedly all about taking back the Holy Land from the Turks or the Muslims. Okay, Shoshana said 1090, so the 11th century. Okay. So the Crusades were all about this. However, the Crusaders were equal opportunity haters. And by the way, they were Christians, 100%. True Christians, not, they weren't really Christians. Yes, they were. Please stop saying that. Yeah, very much Christian. Their shields had crosses and their swords were made into a cross, and they 100% Christians. Bible believing Christians. And they, on their way to pillage and destroy the Turks of the Holy Land, they would, stop at the nearest Jewish village and massacre all the men, women, and children in the Jewish village as practice for their warfare. This is the Crusades. And so when you see a crusader as a Jew, this is what you're reminded of. You're reminded of rape, murder, torture, destruction. Now, isn't it interesting that anybody remember and so in Christianity, what do they most often call evangelical events? Anybody want to answer that? In Christianity, what do they most often call evangelical outreach events? Okay, type it in there. Somebody's, yes, Shoshana, crusades. Campus crusades for Christ. We're going to have an evangelism crusade, a outreach crusade. Now just think about that for a moment. And I want you to think about that on this hand over here. And on the other hand, I want you to ask yourself the question, why don't Jews receive Jesus? Why don't Jews come? I mean, it's so obvious he's the Messiah. Why don't they believe in him? Well, I talk about this in anti-Semitism class that, the reason that Jews don't believe in Jesus, which, that's a whole other topic, but probably because you're too busy killing them for them to kind of get it. And, I mean, can you imagine you're Jewish, right? And you're being invited to a evangelical crusade. That's like saying, hey, would you like to come and join us at the Holocaust? Hey, we're going to have an evangelical Holocaust. Would you like to come? I mean, seriously. So, and we're, it's just, I don't know what you call it. I guess it's ignorance. People don't know that. People look at a crusader and they think, and a lot of times, like I was in a church one time, it's been a long time ago, and we were there renting that facility, and I was just kind of walking down the hallway, and they had a scripture verse up from, I think, the letter to the Ephesians, talking about the full armor of God or whatever. And they had a big mannequin there, and the mannequin was a crusader, with all the armor on. And of course, for them, it makes sense. It's the armor of Christ or whatever, armor of God. But as a Jew, I just sit there like, that's pretty much the same thing as having a mannequin. And listen, guys, I'm not super sensitive, please. I'm not one of those, that walks around with triggers and all this kind of stuff. Don't misunderstand. But I'm just looking at it analytically. I'm not looking at it like, oh my God, I'm not just looking at it analytically going, A crusader pretty much is like having a mannequin of an SS officer standing there. There's really no difference between a Nazi SS officer and a crusader. It's just something to think about. I throw that again. I'm not one of these snowflakes that walks around, and if you're wearing a swastika, I don't like, break out and curl up in a fetal position and start bawling. I think you're kind of a nutty person, but other than that, that's it. But I want you to think about these things because I think that people don't. And it's important to do that. And it starts answering these questions. We can't even get to a discussion about Yeshua because of the centuries of murder. And that's the problem. And that's really the big problem. Yes, you could argue these points. Well, they didn't think the Messiah was going to be divine, or they didn't think this. Well, okay, that's all. Those are deep-rooted questions we can have within a Jewish context, but you can't even get there if you're not even in the Jewish context. So if you're eating a ham sandwich, and celebrating Easter, your discussions about prophecy and the so-called Old Testament are going to fall on deaf ears, as they should. No one's going to give you the time of day, as they should. And so I was having this conversation earlier. I know we kind of got off on a rabbit hole here. I apologize for that. But it's just something to think about. So people have said, well, I'm trying to talk to my Jewish friend about Jesus. And it's like, well, you've got a Christmas tree, you've got a pork chop hanging out of your mouth, and you've got a basket of Easter eggs in your car. He doesn't care, and nor should he, because it's real difficult to take someone seriously who wants to interpret Isaiah for me, and they've got all that going on. So, it's just, you got to kind of think it through. Now, I'm kind of talking to the Levitical choir here about this, but some of you may be watching this and you're like, oh, yeah, right. So if you want to have an honest and intelligent conversation about the Jewish Messiah, then you need to start living according to the Jewish Messiah. You know what I mean? It'd be, well, anyway, you do know what I mean. All right, so let's look at this. One insight, I kind of got off on a rabbit trail there, but I don't know. Maybe it's educational. Perhaps it's helpful. I hope it is. But here is another insight, and we'll kind of wrap it up here. This is a good way to end, because we started out talking about the fact that the righteous can die for you, and that concept comes from the Oral Torah, which is what led me down this whole path of talking about it at length. This is another insight from Rabbi Monk, and it says, after the death of Aaron's two sons, the Midrash connects the death of Aaron's sons with the service of Yom Kippur from another viewpoint. It quotes Rabbi Mordecai, who explains that the death of the righteous is a means of atonement, just as is the Yom Kippur services in Vayikra Rabbah, that's the Midrash Rabbah, chapter 20. So that's critical. It's a rabbi from antiquity stating that the death of a righteous person has the same atonement effect as the Yom Kippur service. Okay. Again, you cannot find that concept in the written Torah, nor can you find it in the prophets, nor in the writings of Torah, Nevi'im, Ketuvim. You can only find that concept in the Pharisaical rabbinical writings. Then remember, the Pharisees are the only ones who believed in the Messiah, or even the concept of Messiah. So if you believe in the Messiah, and then I took you back in time to the first century, you'd be a Pharisee. Isn't that interesting? So it goes on to say here, the disappearance of the righteous from our midst causes us to reflect and leads us to regret and repent about our failings. The severe loss which the nation experiences through the death of the righteous represents a sacrifice, that is a korban chatat, a sin offering, that corresponds to the sacrifices offered in former times in the temple in Jerusalem. So that insight I wanted to conclude with shows that the death of the righteous is in the rabbinic idea equivalent to a sin offering of the temple. Did you hear me when I just said that? From the rabbinic writings, from the Oral Torah, it says that the death of a righteous person is equivalent to a korban chatat, a sin offering in the temple. If that's true about the death of a righteous person, how much more so is it true about the death of the righteous divine Messiah? His death, therefore, would be equivalent to all the offerings, the atonement offerings, the sin offerings, the fellowship offerings, the peace offerings, etc., offered in the temple, which is exactly what it was, which is why he is the final Akedah. All right, more tomorrow, and we will get back to the text and look at some other insights, read some other commentaries on this. And until then, may you have a great day, a blessed day. And hopefully this has already started out to be an insightful day, and may God continue to increase our wisdom and understanding. Shalom Aleichem to all of you, and many, many, many blessings.